There is a specific kind of quiet that settles over a sawmill at the end of the day, once the saw blade stops spinning and the last log truck pulls out of the yard. It's not silence exactly. There's still the tick of cooling metal, the smell of fresh-cut pine hanging in the air, and somewhere behind the main building, a pile of bark slowly, invisibly, generating its own heat in the dark. Most people who drive past a sawmill never think twice about that pile. It looks like scrap. It looks like the one part of the operation nobody wants to deal with. This is the story of a woman who was handed exactly that pile at the worst possible moment of her life, and instead of paying to make it disappear, she spent nearly a decade figuring out what was actually sitting inside it. What she found wasn't garbage. It was chemistry, biology, and, eventually, a second livelihood that outgrew the very reason it existed. In the fall of 2009, on 140 acres just outside a small town in western Wisconsin, a woman named Greet Van Dorn stood at the edge of her late husband's sawmill and looked at a hill of bark that was, by that point, taller than her house. It hadn't happened overnight. For 18 years, the Van Dorn family mill had been cutting red oak, white pine, and hard maple for furniture makers and flooring companies across the Midwest. Every log that came through the debarker shed its skin before it ever touched a saw blade, and for 18 years, that bark had gone into a pile behind the mill that everyone just called the ridge. Nobody thought much about it. Bark was waste. It was the thing you dealt with, not the thing you built something out of. Then in March of that year, Greet's husband Willem had a heart attack behind the wheel of the mill's log loader. He was 58, and within a matter of months, Greet found herself the sole owner of a sawmill she had never run, a payroll she had never met, and a bark pile that had, in the confusion of that year, kept right on growing, because nobody had told the crew to stop feeding the ridge. By the time she finally climbed up to survey it properly, the pile held somewhere around 4,000 cubic yards of bark. To put that in perspective, that is enough material to bury a football field more than 2 feet deep. It was, in the driest possible terms, a liability. Wisconsin's DNR had rules about how long woody waste could sit before it counted as an environmental hazard, since large bark piles can generate significant internal heat through microbial decomposition and, in rare but documented cases, spontaneously combust. Greet had 2 options handed to her by the accountant who came out that October: pay a hauling company somewhere in the neighborhood of $60,000 to truck it to a landfill, or find a way to make it disappear on her own terms. She chose the second option, though at the time, she had no idea what that meant. What she did have was a biology degree from 20 years earlier, mostly forgotten, and a habit of reading late at night when she couldn't sleep. And what she remembered, dimly, from an old soil science course, was that bark was not actually waste at all. It only looked like waste because nobody local was using it correctly. Here is the biological reality. Greet started digging back into that winter. Tree bark is a composite material, made up primarily of 2 structural compounds, lignin and suberin, along with cellulose fibers, tannins, and resins. Lignin is what gives bark its rigidity and its resistance to decay, the same polymer that makes wood itself so durable, and it's part of why bark takes far longer to break down than leaves or grass clippings. Tannins, meanwhile, are the compounds responsible for bark's astringent, almost bitter smell, and they serve the tree as a natural defense against insects and fungal pathogens while the tree is alive. Once bark is stripped off a log at a mill, those same tannins can be a problem for gardeners, because raw, fresh bark can be mildly phytotoxic to seedlings and can tie up nitrogen in the soil as microbes work to break the material down. This is the exact reason experienced landscapers avoid using fresh bark on young plantings, and it's a detail that separates a real mulch operation from someone just shredding tree waste and bagging it. Greet learned that the fix wasn't complicated, but it required patience most people didn't want to spend. Bark needs to be aged, or cured, for a period of 6 months to a year, during which naturally occurring fungi and bacteria begin breaking down the surface tannins and resins, generating heat in the pile, often reaching internal temperatures of 130 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, which also has the side benefit of killing most weed seeds and many plant pathogens that might be lingering in the material. That heat is a genuine composting process, driven by thermophilic microorganisms, the same family of organisms responsible for the heat generated in a well-managed compost bin, just operating on a much larger scale. Greet's mountain of bark, it turned out, had already been sitting for years by accident. Some of the oldest material at the base of the ridge had cured longer than any commercial mulch company would ever bother waiting. She had, without meaning to, been sitting on top of premium aged bark mulch the entire time. The first thing she did was call the extension office at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls, and ask, somewhat sheepishly, whether anyone there tested bark for garden suitability. They did. A soil scientist named Carl Anderson drove out that spring, took samples from 4 different depths in the pile, and ran pH tests, nutrient analysis, and a simple germination bioassay, where cress seeds are planted directly in the material to check whether it inhibits sprouting. The oldest bark, the stuff near the bottom that had been sitting for nearly a decade, passed with what Carl called textbook results. The pH sat around 4.8 to 5.5, which is actually ideal for acid-loving plants like blueberries, azaleas, and rhododendrons. A detail Greet would later turn into one of her strongest selling points. The newer material on top, only a year or 2 old, still needed more time. That distinction became the foundation of her entire business model. Instead of treating the pile as one undifferentiated mountain, she began managing it in layers, screening and selling the fully cured material first, while continuously turning and monitoring the newer bark to bring it up to standard. She bought her first piece of dedicated equipment that summer, a used trommel screen, a rotating cylindrical drum with mesh openings that separates material by particle size as it tumbles through. Oversized chunks and any leftover wood slabs got kicked out one end, while properly sized bark, the kind landscapers actually want, generally in the 1/4 inch to 1.5 inch range, passed through the mesh and out the other. What came out looked, for the first time, like a real product instead of mill waste. She bagged the first batch herself, by hand, in her garage, using plain brown paper feed sacks with a sticker she'd designed on her home computer, a simple pine tree silhouette, and the words, Van Dorn Family Bark Mulch, aged, screened, Wisconsin grown. She drove 40 bags to the farmer's market in Menomonee that June and sold every single one by 10 in the morning. What happened over the following 2 years is the part of this story that surprised even Greet. She started supplying 2 local garden centers on consignment. Then a landscaper from Eau Claire, doing a large commercial job, needed 60 cubic yards on short notice and couldn't get it from his usual supplier in time. Greet could deliver it in 2 days because the material was already sitting on her property, cured and ready. That single job introduced her to the commercial landscaping side of the industry, which operates on volume in a completely different way than retail bagged mulch. A homeowner buys 2 or 3 bags. A commercial contractor doing a business park or apartment complex might need 400 cubic yards in a single order. By 2012, Greet had converted an old hay barn into a proper screening and bagging facility. She'd hired 2 employees from families she'd known her whole life in that township, and she'd bought a used skid steer with a bucket attachment for moving material efficiently. The work itself was unglamorous and physical, turning windrows of curing bark every few weeks with the skid steer to keep oxygen moving through the pile and prevent the anaerobic pockets that can produce a sour, ammonia-like smell rather than the clean, earthy scent of properly aerated compost. She kept a simple logbook, tracking internal pile temperatures with a long compost thermometer, noting which sections were ready to screen and which needed another season. She was also, by then, doing something that most small operations never think to do. She was testing color. Landscape mulch in dyed reds and browns had become enormously popular in suburban markets across the Midwest through the 2000s, largely because consistent color reads as maintained to a homeowner even when the underlying material composition varies. Greet worked with a non-toxic iron oxide-based dye supplier, the same type of coloring agent used in concrete staining, to offer a dyed brown mulch alongside her natural uncolored line. The natural bark, she made sure to tell every customer, actually offered better long-term soil benefits, since it allowed the wood's own tannins and organic matter to integrate into the soil as it broke down further, whereas heavily dyed mulch is sometimes made from lower-quality recycled wood that biologically behaves quite differently. There is a specific biological reason bark mulch outperforms many alternatives for garden use, and it's worth pausing on because it's the kind of detail that turned Greet's small operation into something people trusted rather than just bought from once. A layer of bark mulch, applied at 2 to 3 inches, moderates soil temperature by insulating it from rapid swings, reduces evaporation from the soil surface by as much as 70% in some university trials, and physically blocks light from reaching weed seeds near the surface, suppressing germination without any herbicide involved. As the bark slowly decomposes, primarily through the activity of white rot and brown rot fungi that specialize in breaking down lignin and cellulose, it also feeds an entire underground food web, earthworms, springtails, and beneficial soil fungi, including mycorrhizal species, that form symbiotic relationships with plant roots, extending root systems and improving nutrient uptake. Fresh, unaged bark can disrupt that same food web instead of feeding it, competing with plants for nitrogen as the microbial breakdown gets underway. This is precisely why the aging process Greet had stumbled into by accident was, biologically speaking, the entire difference between a nuisance and an asset. Word of that difference spread the old-fashioned way, through master gardener clubs and county extension newsletters, and by 2014, Greet's operation was supplying nurseries across 3 counties. That same year brought the pivot nobody, including Greet, saw coming. A mushroom grower named Peter Alders, who ran a small shiitake operation out of a converted dairy barn about 20 miles away, came looking for bark specifically, not for landscaping, but for cultivation. Shiitake mushrooms are traditionally grown on hardwood logs, but commercial growers increasingly use bark and sawdust substrates inoculated with mushroom spawn, since the material offers a similar lignin and cellulose content to solid logs while being far easier to sterilize, bag, and control at scale. Oak bark in particular, Peter explained, was excellent for this purpose because of its density and its natural resistance to competing molds, a resistance rooted in those same tannins that made fresh bark tricky for garden use in the first place. What was a liability in one context was a genuine asset in another. Greet began setting aside a specific, additional processed batch of oak bark for Peter's operation. Heat-treated further and screened to a finer, more consistent particle size for substrate blocks. Within a year, she was supplying 3 mushroom growers across the region, and mushroom substrate had become a small but genuinely profitable second product line, one with almost no competition locally because nobody else was positioned to supply it. By 2016, 7 years after Willem's death, the sawmill itself was running at roughly the same capacity it always had, still cutting oak, pine, and maple for the same regional buyers. But the operation around it had transformed. What had once been a waste stream requiring a $60,000 disposal bill had become a standalone division, generating by Greet's own accounting shared later with a regional Farm Bureau publication, close to a third of the total revenue of the entire family business. She employed 6 people directly in the mulch and substrate division alone. She had expanded the trommel screening line to a second, larger unit. She had a delivery truck with her own logo on the side, the same simple pine tree from that first hand-drawn sticker, just professionally reproduced. Perhaps the detail that says the most about how far the operation had come by then was a small research partnership she struck up with the same extension office that had first tested her bark back in 2009. Together, they began tracking soil carbon changes in test plots using her aged bark mulch compared to plots left bare or mulched with straw. The early results, consistent with broader agricultural research on woody mulches, showed measurable increases in soil organic carbon over a 3-year period in the bark mulched plots, a modest but real contribution to carbon sequestration happening quietly in ordinary home gardens and landscaping beds across the region. There was one more chapter to the bark story that Greet hadn't expected either, and it came from an entirely different direction: erosion control. In 2015, a county road crew doing culvert repair along a creek bank near the mill needed a fast, biodegradable way to stabilize freshly graded soil before the next heavy rain came through. Straw blankets, the standard option, tended to wash out on steeper grades. Greet suggested a coarser, unscreened bark product left over from her trommel line, the oversized chunks that didn't pass through the mesh, and had, until then, simply been set aside as leftover material. Spread a few inches thick and tamp down, coarse bark interlocks in a way that finer mulch doesn't, resisting sheet erosion while still allowing water to infiltrate rather than run off. The county crew used 4 truckloads on that job and came back for more the following spring for a similar project. What had been the reject stream from her main product line became, almost by accident, a small niche of its own. Erosion control bark sold by the truckload to municipal crews and a handful of private landowners dealing with washouts along ponds and stream banks. Around that same period, Greet also began setting aside a portion of her lowest grade, most degraded bark for an entirely different process: slow pyrolysis, essentially baking the material at high temperature with very little oxygen to produce biochar. Biochar is a stable, carbon-rich material that, unlike raw bark, does not readily decompose once it's worked into soil. Research out of several land-grant universities has shown that biochar can improve soil water retention, provide habitat for beneficial soil microbes within its porous structure, and lock carbon away in a form that can persist in soil for centuries rather than years. Greet never scaled this part of the operation much beyond small test batches sold to a handful of interested market gardeners, but it was, in its own quiet way, the clearest proof of how far her thinking on that original mountain of waste had traveled. She was no longer just disposing of bark. She was sorting it, by grade and by purpose, into an entire menu of products, each one suited to a different biological need. Greet Van Dorn never set out to become a mulch producer. She set out, in the roughest year of her life, to avoid a landfill bill and keep a family business from folding under the weight of one very literal mountain of waste. What she found underneath that mountain, once she was willing to actually study it instead of just hauling it away, was a material with real, well-documented biological value that had simply been sitting there unused because nobody had taken the time to understand what they were looking at. The bark pile that once threatened to bury her, quite literally listed by the state as an environmental liability, became the foundation of a business that outlasted the reason it existed in the first place. The mill still cuts lumber. The bark still comes off every log. And somewhere on that same 140 acres, a new ridge is curing right now, 6 months into the process, on its way to becoming next year's mulch, next year's mushroom substrate, and next year's proof that on a farm, there is rarely such a thing as true waste, only material that hasn't found its purpose yet. Talk to enough people who run family sawmills, small dairy operations, or row crop farms passed down through 3 generations, and you'll hear some version of this same story more often than you'd expect. A byproduct nobody wanted. A slow season that forced someone to actually sit down and study what they had on hand instead of just paying to haul it away. A local extension office or a university soil lab willing to run a few tests for free. And a person stubborn enough or simply out of easier options to spend a year finding out whether the thing everyone else called garbage was actually something else entirely. Greet still keeps that first hand-drawn sticker, the pine tree silhouette from 2010, framed on the wall of what is now a proper office next to the screening barn. She says she keeps it there less as decoration and more as a reminder of how little she actually knew when she started, and how much of what she eventually learned came from asking the right specialist a simple, almost embarrassing question: what exactly is this stuff? And what is it actually good for? It turned out to be a question worth 10 years of an answer.